You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text and Glossa House TV. I'm Michael Halcomb, and today I have the great privilege of talking with Dr. Ken Berding. This is our first time meeting, and so I'm really thrilled about this. The biblical scholar world it feels kind of big, but in a way it's kind of small too. So I think our paths have maybe crossed. We've walked past each other at conferences or maybe exchanged a word, but I don't know if we've ever really spoke before. So it's good to meet you, Ken, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, it's really good to meet you too. I'm glad for the opportunity to be hanging out with you today.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, so I live in Southern California. I'm a teacher at Biola University, so Talbot School of Theology there. I teach New Testament classes. I teach elementary Greek classes as well. My wife and I lead up a discipleship community where we have 11 college students who live on campus with us. That is where our property is, and we pray together.
Wow.
And we meet for individual discipleship times. We have meals together, and our last college student just showed up about 20 minutes ago.
Oh, wow.
So that's all going on as we speak. I'm also an elder at my church, at Redemption Hill Church, and I write books and articles.
You got a lot of great stuff going on there. That's interesting. That sounds kind of unique. I'm not sure I've ever heard of that. So talk a little more about that sort of discipleship community. That seems pretty neat.
Yeah, so we didn't name it, but it ended up getting called the Birdhouse. My last name is Berding, and it comes from that. And my wife and I lead it together. We lived overseas in the Middle East for a long time, much more communal setting, much more community oriented. And when we came back, I'm a nerd, so I knew I was going to go back, work toward a PhD, hopefully teach, but I really didn't just want to be a talking head. I wanted to actually make a difference, be part of God's kingdom purposes. And one of the goals in that was just to try to spend time with college students. So we prayed about this for a long time. I mean, we constantly have students in our home. You just got to understand, we're just always having students in. But then the idea of being able to have them live in community with us, and you need to understand, this isn't a commune or a compound or anything like that. We avoid words like that. We're more like close neighbors. So we have 3 living flats on the same property. And my family lives in one, a group of guys lives in another, and a group of girls lives in another. This year we have 11 students, last year 11. Usually it's 10. And the goal is just to have them here for a year, and we just pour into them and pray that God will actually do something through their time here and help them to become world changers. So
Wow. That's I'm not sure I've heard of that anywhere else, like on college campuses. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's not directly associated with Biola, but all of our students come from Biola, so we're adjunct to that.
You mentioned the Middle East. Were you serving, were you doing mission work? Were you teaching? Were you just working? What? You don't have to say exactly what you're doing or whatever, but what was the nature of sort of being in the Middle East?
Yeah, our goal was there to just to be helping to start a church where there was no church. And God was gracious to do that, but not in the way that we thought. So it was a time of learning, a time of growing. I would say a time of humbling. Some of the things were very hard. I mean, it's not easy to go into a place where all the people, every person that you would talk to anywhere would describe themselves as a Muslim, and there's no church. And just to pray that God will raise up something there. It really does require a miracle, a work of God to do that. But we learned a lot, so that's an important part of my background. If your listeners are trying to get to know me, that's an important part of my background.
Now, obviously, when we come to talking about the New Testament, I mean, having some basic understanding of Middle East, even today, right? Like,
Exactly.
can I think shine some light on, things that are going on in the New Testament.
For sure.
One that comes to mind for me, and maybe, you could probably talk about a lot more, but I remember my first time going to Turkey
Mm,
and seeing the evil eye medallions all over
yeah.
the place. I'd never seen that before. And I know like in South America there's some places that's still prominent, but and then like it helped me understand differently like Galatians 3:1 or other places that talk about like the evil eye or looking with envy on someone.
Yeah.
So what are some things that having lived in the Middle East might have helped you get a new perspective on or a new appreciation for something in the New Testament or even the Old?
Yeah, well, that's a great place to start. Just the folk religious magical backgrounds that inform some of our readings of the Bible are really helpful because there's no question, Paul, who's the person I hang out with the most in the New Testament, he he's really concerned about people understanding spiritual warfare and the pressures that are out there. I mean, when I was living in the Middle East, we lived just down the road from this hill that was people would show up and put little what they called kind of wishes. I think that would be the easiest way to
Hmm.
translate it. Hoping that a person would get better, or that they would pass a university entrance exam, or that someone that they loved would fall in love with them. And they put them on these hills, and you can see thousands of these on this hill. And why? It's because there was a person who had lived there in the past. How much of it is, how much of it is history and how much of it is just legend, who is known as Waterless Grandfather, and I have no idea why. And that somehow his power still resided on this mountain. So that is folk religion, and it just permeates, the Middle East. It's
Hmm.
all over the place. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I could give you so many examples. A person who actually
Yeah.
came to Christ, a new believer, he showed me around his house one time. His wife, who was upset that he'd become a believer, had cut off a little bit of his hair and wrapped it into some curses, and was not happy at all, was trying to put a curse on him. So these types of things are real, and they were going on in the time of the Bible. Other things from the Middle East that would be really helpful: the deep cultural implications of honor and shame.
Hmm.
Honor and shame is very important to understand if you're going to understand Old Testament and New Testament, for sure. And that the Middle East is just saturated with that. Insiders and outsiders. Who are insiders?
Hmm.
Who are outsiders? That's an important question. Family solidarity. Those are some things that come to mind, particularly. I'm sure that there are others as well. But what I often will do when I'm reading the Bible and I'm not sure how to read something, I'll just kind of take off my American hat and I'll put on my Middle Eastern hat, and I'll
Hmm.
just see, okay, now how would one of my Middle Eastern friends read this? How would they view this? And it doesn't always resolve it, but it gives me a head
Right.
start. And a lot of times it's a better head start than, starting from our American mindset.
Yeah, I love that. The ability to do that's one thing, but the having the awareness, oh, I need to do this, that's a whole other thing, and
Yeah.
that's hard if you haven't been like rooted in a place like that
Yeah.
to cognitively like switch gears, right? It
And,
takes a
and,
lot of yeah, go
and
ahead.
to be honest, sometimes people they begin to learn about it, they overstate it. So,
Right.
like you hear about, Middle Eastern, or
Yeah.
lots of cultures, a lot of global South cultures being collectivist cultures. And so
Yeah.
then people are like, I remember having a student one time who was just being exposed to this for the first time, someone who'd grown up in California. And he all of a sudden started freaking out. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Does that mean there is an individual salvation?
Right, right.
And it's just an overstatement of the culture. It's not that, I don't know, a lot of the cultures of the global South are collectivist and we are individualist, and
Yeah.
it's all on a spectrum. So we just
Right.
happen to be more individualistic with collectivist ideas, and there are a lot more collectivists with individual ideas. And so you got to be really careful of
Yeah.
those types of things.
I appreciate that. I mean, the, it's often when you read some of the socio-cultural or,
Yeah.
those types of things, those types of social science works and New Testament studies, right? I agree that it gets overstated. I fell into that early on. When I was starting my MDiv, I was sitting down in the basement of a seminary library, and I had stumbled upon the social scientific commentary by Bruce Molina and Jerome Nere,
Sure.
and I remember I pulled one of those books out. I think it was the one on Paul, and I sat there. I probably read 3/4 of that book just sitting on the ground, and my like world was exploding.
Right.
And it's very easy in the wake of something like that to become overzealous,
Right.
and
Exactly.
to think that, oh, the people in the New Testament or the Old Testament could not individuate.
Right.
That's kind of that's not even how the collectivist mindset works, or the honor shame, right? The
Yeah.
idea is if I do something dishonorable, it's going to shame the group, right? So obviously
Yeah.
they're able to individuate.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
that's a great reminder.
Actually, if
Yeah,
if any of your readers want to go more into this, about 20 years ago, I wrote an article, particularly on that context group you're talking about
yeah,
Molina,
yeah.
Rohrbaugh, Pilch, all those folks. It's called the Hermeneutical Frameworks of Social Scientific
Mm,
Criticism, with a subtitle, How Much Can Evangelicals Get Involved? So it's basically
mm,
trying to deal with how can we use this? Can we not use it?
yeah, right.
And I think that might be a good starting point for any of your listeners who are
I think
interested.
I've
Because I
read
think
that
there's a lot of
before.
fruit in this
Yeah,
area. There's a lot you can
yeah.
learn from it. You just have to be wise.
So as I was entering into my master's degrees and then a PhD, I was in part of that context group. When we had SBLs, I was going up to
Oh,
their hotel room meetings. They would have parties every night. I don't know if people knew that, but they threw some kind of a little bit of wild parties. At least, I mean, people just
this is news
liquor
to
for
me.
days.
Yeah.
Yeah, liquor for days. And it was interesting how this is what I find interesting, Ken, is the longer I was part of that group, the more I realized that the sort of heuristic, the hermeneutical framework or whatever that they were using in their publications, they were also part of that group. So in
Yeah.
group, out group. You
That's right.
don't dare question Pilch and Molina, the fathers of social scientific
Yeah.
criticism and biblical studies. That'll bring shame upon you and the group. Like,
That's a
this is
hilarious way to put it, actually.
yeah. I mean, well, they talked about him, Molina and Pilch, like the kinship terminology. They're the fathers of this. You
Right.
know, like
Well,
so
I
all
mean,
of those things were going on within their own group.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, they talk about emic and etic
Right.
perspectives to
Yes.
either be
Right.
insiders or outsiders. And
Yes.
clearly, the context group they were doing an etic perspective. They were looking from the outside and describing it from the outside. I mean, there's no way not to do that, and it's
Yeah.
even legitimate to do it. And there's a lot you can learn from it. You just have to be humble. You have to be
Yeah.
careful. So,
Yeah.
and some of their writings do lack that. Despite how
Oh
much I've
yeah.
learned from them, I
Yeah.
just want to I
That's
just
right.
want to put that out there. I've appreciated and grown. And if anyone reads that little article I wrote, they'll see that I do appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. They were that commentary was a sort of aha moment, a turning point for me.
Right.
Those guys influenced my own thinking for a long time. It became a little more nuanced over time, and I sort of exited that group. But um, yeah, I'm with you. I'm grateful. But I read some of Pilch's stuff, and I'm like, whoo, like he
Yeah.
says some stuff that'll make you wonder, like, is this guy a believer, like so I've read that article of yours that you're talking about.
Right.
It's been a while, so my memory's a little foggy on that, but yeah, I'd encourage readers or watchers, viewers, listeners to go back and check that out too. So
Well,
well, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Molina
um
basically says that the Bible is something to be described. I forgot his exact terminology. You're to describe the world that's there, but it doesn't have any warrant. Oh, I remember. He says
mm,
it's a witness to what life was like then, but not a warrant for us. So basically, he puts a wedge between the then and the now. And so he
Right.
just, in his own mind, he's just functioning as a social historian.
Right. Yeah. Whew. You've written a lot more than that article. I mean, you've written stuff on Romans. You've written some workbooks on Romans. You've written about spiritual gifts. Let's can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure, we can talk about
So
that.
um, spiritual gifts. I mean, this is always kind of a hot topic. It never seems to be a topic that will go away. And every couple of years or so, it seems like there's always a flare up about sort of cessationism, and then it'll die back down, or then you see sort of the far charismatic side like doing some interesting things. And so yeah, when you in your book on spiritual gifts, what's your sort of thesis? What are you attempting to argue there?
Yeah, so my issue is not continuationism versus cessationism at all. Uh, I'm, I actually live kind of in both worlds. I'm a
Mm,
continuationist myself, but I have a lot of friends who are in the cessationist communities, and I
right.
have great respect for them, great appreciation for them, and certainly in the continuationist side of things, I mean, there's a whole spectrum. Some folks I don't really have great respect for, but many people I do. So, uh, but that's not my issue. My
Yeah.
issue is, what are we even talking about? I mean, I don't think Paul would recognize our discussion. I think he would
Mm,
like, what are you talking about? Because here's the basic idea. I think if you want to call it, I call it the conventional view of spiritual gifts. That is, that you have some sort of special ability that you need to somehow discover and then use in ministry. One of my colleagues at Biola, he calls it tongue in cheek a superpower. So it's like you have
mm,
a superpower, you don't know you have it, and then you discover it. And of course, sometimes that means through taking some sort of spiritual gifts test, or in some people would say by serving for a while, you eventually learn that you're a good teacher or that you particularly
mm,
flourish in serving, or whatever it happens to be. But I don't think that at all is what's going on. I think I think what Paul is actually talking about is he's saying that if you were to say to him, what is a spiritual gift? He would say it is a ministry assignment that's been given by God that is empowered by the Holy Spirit, with the emphasis being on the assignment rather than the power. So what we've done is we've taken the major idea and we've inverted it. So the major idea is the ministry assignment. What is given to you? What is given by His grace? What is the charisma, if you want to say that, the concrete expression of God's grace that He's given to you? Is a it is a spirit assigned ministry or a role. And yes, it is empowered by the Holy Spirit. But what we've done is we've seen the kind of the power side of thing, and we've made it the thing.
huh.
And then we just said, and you're supposed to use it in ministry. It's what philosophers call category confusion.
Mm,
So we know what that is. As Christians, we know what category confusion is. So the word church. You talk to a regular person out in the world, you say, what's a church? And they'll describe a building. And we're all like, no, a church
mm,
is believers. It's people who meet together. They can meet under a tree out in a field somewhere. So it's category confusion. And
mm,
that's what's going on here. There's a category confusion that has taken hold of the evangelical mind in particular over the last couple of generations. I mean, it just was not a very big thing before the 1970s in evangelical churches. They borrowed it from Pentecostal and charismatic churches. So that goes back to the beginning of the 1900s. Before that, it's just not the same.
mm.
So this is something. So my issue has to do with just what are we even talking about?
Great. Yeah.
So
Wow.
that's what that
Uh,
that's what that book's about. It's a little bit dated now. I'd love to rework it because I wrote it 20 years ago.
hmm.
But
You
but
have
I've
a lot
still
to talk about. Yeah, I mean, a lot. developed since then. Well, maybe not. I mean, I
Not
guess
in that
what goes.
area.
Yeah.
But I think I get an email every month or two from a pastor just saying, "Thank you. You've just taken
Mm,
the pressure off of me."
that's awesome.
Because, when you're a pastor in a church, you feel like, I got to say something about spiritual gifts. But, Paul
Mm,
talks about body life and serving and building up one another. And, and anyway, he talks about spiritual gifts, or what we call spiritual gifts anyway. I'm not even sure I love the nomenclature, as a reaction to what's going on in Corinth in particular.
right.
And in the
Right.
other places he talks about, it just doesn't even look like what we're talking about, like in Romans
Yeah.
and Ephesians. But
So what?
there's so much. I mean, you're just opening up a topic that we could just go really deep dive on this
Right.
one, but
Well, I want to
more
point people to your book. I need to get a hold of that one. I haven't read that one myself. I need to get a hold of that one. That sounds like a pretty fascinating premise. Where did the interest in Paul come from? I mean,
yeah.
that's been a huge focus in my own life. Paul, I would say, it's been Paul and, Jesus. I study Mark a lot, but if I'm not in like the Gospel of Mark, I'm usually doing something Pauline.
Oh,
So
yeah.
what is it about Paul that captured you? Can you like trace your way back to a point where that sort of began developing, or?
Yeah, I think I do know where it started from, and it's different for me than for a lot of people. I think for most people, I think they're interested in the theology, and that wasn't my entree into Paul. My entree into Paul was just kind of loving the person who Paul was. I loved his
Mm,
radical commitment to follow Jesus anywhere, his willingness to just lay down his life for Jesus. He's brilliant, but he was also an activist, and he's deeply spiritual as well.
mm,
So I've always been really drawn to the sections of Paul that you really get to know him. I love Second Corinthians, for example. I'm even working on a
mm,
book right now on Second Corinthians. I love um, I love Philippians. Both of those show his heart just tons. And yes, I've done some work in Romans, but that was hard for me. It took me a long time to really own Romans, like to really be
mm,
in Romans, because my entree into Paul was through Paul as a person. In fact, when I started
mm,
teaching at Biola, they assigned me to teach a class called Pauline Literature, which is great. But about 3 years later, I'm still teaching this class to this day. I was like, can we just change the name of it to Life and Letters of Paul, so
mm.
that I could help people get into Paul as a person as well? Because I think you learn a lot about what he's doing, even as a theologian,
Yeah.
by understanding him as a missionary, as a teacher,
Mm.
as a Christian, before first and foremost.
Yeah, lots of interesting theories about Paul. And I don't know, do you think, let me just ask you this and then I'll ask you a follow-up question. And from your perspective, do you think Paul was ever married?
Yeah. By the way, I'd love to hear how you got into Paul as well. That would
Yeah,
be
I'll tell you in a
really
minute.
interesting. Maybe we could take a
You got
moment.
to answer this question first.
Oh no.
No,
Okay.
I'm just kidding.
So
Yeah.
certainly he was working his way up in Phariseeism. It looks like most people would have been married. Uh, he shows great tenderness to Timothy, but I don't think that really does it. I am somewhat persuaded by the argument that's made in 1 Corinthians 7, that the unmarried that he's talking about
Mm,
there
you're right.
is not equivalent to singleness. He's talking about people who are previously married, so people who had a spouse who died or possibly were divorced in some way. That argument, when I first heard it, I remember I was like, no, I just really skeptical. And the more I looked at it, I'm like, well, I'm not 100% persuaded, but it seems like a better argument than the opposite. So,
Mm,
so yes, my leaning is that Paul was previously married. And if I had
mm,
to guess, I would guess that he was previously married and somehow connected with Tarsus, and that somehow during those years in Tarsus, when he was trying to minister to Jews, trying to share about Christ after he had been converted. Maybe even his wife and his maybe kids, I don't know. I have no idea.
Mm,
Got
yeah.
pulled back by her family. I literally saw this happen in the Middle East one time. A guy who came to the Lord, he came home one day, and his wife's parents had come in and cleared out everything from the apartment, pulled her back into the family, and never let him speak to her again, which is horrible, terrible. But I sometimes imagine that. Now, I have no evidence that that happened, but that's the way I imagine it,
Mm,
based upon at least the few clues that you have in 1 Corinthians 7 that he might have been
mm.
previously married. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I kind of lean probably the opposite direction,
Okay.
but I couldn't tell you why. I think there's something knocking around in the back of my head. Um, maybe I find it frustrating that people try to make that argument that Paul is like anti-woman, or like a male chauvinist because he got burned by a woman, and that's why he writes all these negative things. So like that's kind of knocking around the back of my head, and I'm like, I don't get that from Paul, man.
No, I don't get that
Yes, he
either.
has to deal with, like, he has some issues in dealing with women in Corinth. I have an explanation for that. Um, and then you have the women in Ephesus. He's talking to Timothy, but there's a whole explanation for that too. I just don't see that sort of male chauvinist Paul at all.
No, I don't think so
And
either. And he had
maybe I
so many
yeah.
female friends and coworkers too.
Right,
Just look at the
exactly.
list at the end of
Yes.
Romans 16.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. And then just the lack of an explicit mention of a wife or kids, when he mentions, like, that Peter is
yeah.
married in 1 Corinthians 9, but he doesn't say anything about, his himself. So I'm not sure. And when he's in prison, we're not hearing anything about, a wife and kids. Instead, he's talking about his children in the faith.
Well, Michael, I think
Um,
there's no question that he
no.
was not married when he's writing. I think I
Right.
think that's
Yeah, yeah.
undeniable. I mean, 1 Corinthians
Yeah.
7 makes that clear. I wish everyone were as I am, and he means
Right,
by that
right,
single. And his comment in 1 Corinthians 9 that you just said, don't we have a right to take along a wife? Don't Barnabas
right.
and I have a right to take along a wife? Like, Cephas and the other apostles do.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think it's clear. He's not married at that point. But the
Right,
question is whether he was ever previously married
right.
or not.
Yeah. That's hard, man. I don't know. I mean, the sort of radio silence is, I don't know, I pay attention to that, but I think I'm asking you because I think it's such a fascinating question. And was he a widower? What did something go down like you described a moment ago, or
Mhm.
was there a divorce? Um,
Yeah.
so all that's pretty interesting to me. I was watching a documentary series recently, um, and I cannot remember the name of the guy who did it, but it was interesting because in this documentary, the scholar is attempting to, like, he's talking about, I'm less interested in the theology of Paul. Yeah, everybody's talking about that. He's
Mhm.
like, I want to know, where did Paul get his haircut?
Yeah,
He's
I'm
like,
interested in stuff like that too. I'm
yeah,
really interested in
exactly.
Paul. Yeah.
So where did he go for lunch?
Yeah.
And those things are really interesting to me too. And this is one of those things that, it's the question's always sort of knocked around in the back of my head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's an easy way to answer it. I think we're going to have to leave it as I have a leaning in this way or that way. But
Right.
I think there might be a little bit in 1 Corinthians 7 that could help resolve it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one of the other things you've done on Paul is, of course, the thorn in the flesh,
Yeah.
and I've read some of your blog posts in your book on this, which is another fascinating topic, and
Yeah.
lots, like, centuries of discussion
Mhm.
about this. And so your view is pretty interesting. I don't know how much you want to give away in the podcast,
Sure.
but we'll
I'll give
point.
away
We'll,
anything you want me to give away.
well, to point people to your book, it's titled Paul's Thorn in the Flesh, right? And so, you guys can go check that out when you get a chance. The subtitle of that, New Clues for an Old Problem. And so, alluding to the fact there of, this really long ongoing discussion about Paul's thorn in the flesh. So, um, yeah, what is in general, like, what's your sort of take on this?
Right. Well, just so you know, it's that the argument is in the details. So you can't just, I'm not going to persuade anyone in the next 3 minutes or 4 minutes or
You
5
go
minutes
into some,
of
yeah,
this.
you go into a lot of details in the
But
book. Yeah.
I have written this book in a way that people who are really interested and serious about studying the Bible, but don't know all kind of the scholars jargon, that they can read it. So I've definitely done it in that way. It's an academic book, but if anyone wants to read it, it's readable. But
Yeah.
but basically, I worked through clues, some of them which have already been identified by people, and some of them that have not been identified by people, and just try to draw up a list of 20 criteria that would help to basically narrow the options of what Paul's thorn in the flesh could have been. So basically, what you've got, you said people have been talking about this for forever. Yes, but the very best thing that's ever been written on this, I would say, until I came out with an academic book on this, I didn't say that very well. It didn't come across very well.
That's all
Is
right.
is an article in German that's 28 pages long, and most of that is
Hmm.
not argumentative. In other words, there's been very little serious hard work done on this, which is crazy. I mean, you're in biblical
Hmm.
studies. You know how people take the smallest things and
Right.
they write doctoral dissertations on it, and I'm just flabbergasted by how little has actually been done seriously on this. So what I did
Hmm.
is, and I realized that it is so distracting to see what everyone else is doing. I spent a year where I only took kind of side glances at kind of specialized ancillary things that would help me that I just didn't know about. Otherwise, I didn't read what people were writing about this and just thought about it, looked at the
Hmm.
Bible, went into the historical stuff, made connections, wrote down drafts, thought about stuff, and then I went back and I backfilled and started seeing, okay, where did I have a boneheaded argument here? But usually they weren't addressing it because most of the things that are
Hmm.
dealt with in this book, that's not right. Most is not the right way to put it. Probably a good half of the things in this book have already been identified somehow, somewhere by someone. And I've just drawn upon it and then taken them further. And I could give you examples of this. I'll
Hmm.
give you an example. So intertextuality is talked about all the time among biblical scholars. You know, how the New Testament is connected to the Old
Right.
Testament. And even, Richard Hayes, he's got his famous books on echoes. But, he uses examples.
Which as of this week, or I've been reading the reviews on his latest book, The Widening of God's Mercy or whatever, and he's sort of recanting. He's taking it back. He actually, in the new book that he's got coming out, he is grieving some of his other work. But anyways, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think that's on a different topic,
Oh
isn't
yeah,
it?
the moral
Yeah,
vision of the New
the
Testament.
moral
That's right.
issues,
Yep.
right. Yeah, the
Yep.
one I'm talking about is still
The
standard,
echoes. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
just the echoes that are in the New Testament,
Right. Right.
how
Right.
the New Testament authors use the Old Testament.
That's right. Yes.
Anyway, he uses examples in there that if you even begin to nod in that direction and say, yeah, he's got some sort of case there, then you would have to grant some sort of connection between Paul's, comments in 2 Corinthians 12:7 and the book of Job. There's just a lot of
Hmm.
connections there. So I wrote a chapter on that. There are also, there's a historical background that hasn't been delved into. I mean, they were literally fashioning voodoo dolls out of all
Right.
sorts of things, out of clay, whatever else. And I mean, I think we've dug up 3 dozens of these things now, and they were fashioning them and they were sticking them with thorns. And nobody has really connected this and said, this could be a background. So how are people going to understand that? If Paul starts talking about a thorn in the flesh, an angel of
Uh,
Satan to beat on me, are they not going to be thinking about some sort of attack by a sorcerer, a magician of some sort? And the answer is they probably would have. Whether he was actually being attacked by a magician or not, I mean, Clint Arnold says it's very likely he was at some point. But whether or not in this case he actually was, and that's not the issue, is that's how people would have understood it.
Right.
So that helps to narrow the possibilities of what it could have been. And then there's just lots of details thrown all over the place, the way he uses. So I'm going at it all sorts of sides. I had to go into early church. Irenaeus and Tertullian have statements that are it's very obvious that both of them thought it was a physical condition. And they are in a categorically different place than all the other early church people who actually comment about Paul's thorn in the flesh, because they're writing, Irenaeus is writing 115 years after Paul's death, Tertullian about 130 years, and they both think it's a physical condition. And Tertullian even says that it's something of his ear and, his face and his ear. And so what's going on there? And there's a lot of other things as well. So I'm telling you again, the argument is in the details. There
Right.
are a good solid 80 or 100 details in this, but it narrows it down basically to 20 criteria. Once you have these 20 criteria,
Right.
it narrows the options, and then I narrow it down to 7 medical conditions that it possibly could be, and then compare the criteria to other leading suggestions that are out there. And in the end, I argue that, here you go, drum roll please, that it was a craniofacial pain of Paul, something happening on his face or his head that would have been shameful, would have been viewed as an attack by a demon, but by Paul as an attack by a demon, but permitted by God and controlled by God, and that it was, the purpose of it was to keep him humble and to show him that strength was made perfect in weakness. And there's a lot more than just what I said there, but that's
Right. Sure.
That's the center of it. And there are 7 medical conditions which I go into in some detail in the book.
Remember that. Yeah.
That actually overlap with that.
Yeah. So, I've heard, I think probably the leading view that, at least I've heard preachers and professors say over the years, Paul had bad eyesight kind of thing. And that's often chalked up, the source of that bad eyesight. A lot of, what I've heard is of course the Damascus Road experience.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
When he got blinded. Yeah.
Right.
So that's, that's kind of interesting. And then he's writing with big letters, and then in Galatians 3 he's talking about, or Galatians, you'd rip your eyes out and give them to me, and all these clues. So I think it's a fascinating topic, and I have read the book. It's maybe a couple years. I don't know how long it's been since I read it, but I do remember you going into the 7 theories there, and I even read your follow-up sort of blog posts, I believe, to that.
Well, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so I've read several things of yours. I want to shift gears a little bit, because something that's very different than that is the Sing and Learn New Testament Greek. So, I had that too, the little blue album, right? And a CD case. I remember getting that as a Greek student in seminary. So what was the genesis of that project?
Well, first of all, I'm aware. I think you're like part of the whole Living Greek movement.
That's right. Right.
And so I'm just aware of my limitations here, but I'll tell you my story. I was a Greek minor in college, and my Greek minor, that's biblical Greek, because I was a theology major, my biblical Greek minor was really robust. It was really rigorous. And,
Mm.
within a few months of having finished, I had already read through the New Testament in Greek. And
Wow.
we worked really hard in that program. And then I went overseas and I had to learn a really hard Middle Eastern language. And I kept up my Greek and I'm hanging with my Greek and I'm doing it. And I'm learning this other language. I'm keeping up with my Greek. And about a year and a half to it, I was just mentally tired. And so I said, I'm going to
Mm.
just set my Greek aside for a little bit. And I'm just going to pour myself into this language until I just got it. And so I did. And I got to the point I wanted to be. And a couple years later, I came back to Greek, knowing basically what the contours of the whole thing was, having forgotten some of it, just not keeping up with it, not having been reading in the
Right.
New Testament. And so you could say that I had to relearn Greek. But this time, I'm like,
Right.
I didn't really have to relearn it. That's not fair, but
Right.
that's the way
Right.
I taught
Sure.
it. So I'm getting to learn it a second time, knowing where I'm going. And I'm thinking, you know what, this time I'm actually going to learn it in a way I'm not going to forget it. And I'm going to learn it in a way that I can teach others. So I just started,
Mm.
and since I learned from the sort of paradigm method, I just
Yeah.
started grabbing the paradigms and putting them to music. So I have a musical background. At first, I started putting them to really cool songs. They really were nice. And then I realized, you know what? It would be much better to just do this as an earworm, something that is going to stick in their heads. So I started pulling children's songs and nursery rhymes, and
Right.
I listened to, I don't know, I listened to ice cream trucks going down the street and trying to put the Greek paradigms to it. I really did that.
That's great.
And for years, I was just adding on one at a time. And then I started teaching Greek. And then I would just add one more and then one more. And then I recorded it in a dorm room of one of my students one time, and they used that for a little bit. And then I pitched it to Zondervan, and they're like, yeah, that's weird. Let's do
All
it.
right.
And so I did. And we've been singing those songs ever since. So there's a lot of Greek students who still
Mm.
sing these songs. And the difference is that you remember them. So I have
Right.
students come up to me early on as they're learning these things. They're like, Dr. Berding, am I cursed forever? like, what do you mean? And they're like, am I cursed to wake up in the middle of the night and have these songs going through my head? I'm like, yeah, that was the goal.
That's
So,
funny.
so it
That's
just makes
great.
it simpler for them to remember all the forms of the and all the noun endings,
Mm-hmm.
and of
Well,
course,
I think that, that's that sort of stuff. I mean, and I hope this sounds right. So I don't know. I hope it's taken received in the way that I mean it. But like, I think those kinds of resources helped maybe a little bit kick off this sort of renaissance in the spoken biblical Greek
yeah,
circles.
cool.
I couldn't, I don't have any way to quantify that or even prove it, but I will say, like, I found myself as a seminary student taking Greek. Phones weren't even a big thing back then. They didn't have, like, you could record yourself. Because I
Hmm,
bought one of those little Radio Shack. It was like a handheld recorder,
hmm.
right? And I would read passages in Greek to myself, and then as I was driving to class, I'd hit play and I'd be
That's cool.
listening to that. And it was like somebody speaking Greek to me. The songs like this, it's somebody, doing the paradigm stuff, but nevertheless still speaking some Greek to me.
Right.
And then, Danny Zacharias had come up with a slew of songs too, somebody speaking Greek to me.
Mhm.
And some of that stuff, I think shaped me along the way. These are, I think, some of the resources that helped, kick some of that off. So I don't know if anybody in our sort of conversational circles have ever said anything like that to you,
Well,
but
well, thank you.
um,
I
yeah,
mean, I love the living Greek idea, and I would have been all over it
yeah,
in the past, and still am encouraging people in moving this direction. I mean, I do fluently
yeah,
speak foreign language, and I've studied a pile of others, of course.
yeah.
But I'm reading in Greek all the time myself. I don't know how many times I've read through the New Testament, 13, 14 times, something like that.
Mm,
but constantly in it. But I really wish I had had the opportunity to go through what y'all are doing. I think it's great.
Mm,
I think anything you
I,
can do to help develop fluency is way more important than just teaching people a few things and having them look up stuff
right.
and then try to figure it out. We've got to get people who can really uh, know it at a deeper level.
Right. I appreciate that. There's been an antagonism that's existed
Yeah,
sort of from the grammar translation side of the camp and then the living language side of the camp. There's been an antagonist. And I've been in those arguments over and over and over, and I've totally pulled myself out of the arguments. I
yeah,
just don't want
that's
to
fine.
do that anymore. But so I still write some stuff about that, and if I'm teaching Greek, I will do a living language approach. But one of the things we've tried to do at Glossa House, because my colleague Fred Long, he teaches a grammar translation approach. I teach this living. We've tried to find a happy medium, or at least some ways to integrate the two.
Yeah, that's great.
Um, and overcome sort of this antagonism that exists, as you were talking about earlier. When someone first comes into like the social science work, right, and they're reading it, and this was me, like you get deep into it and you see things a different way. Quickly you can overstate the case, and similar with me when I first got into this living language stuff, it was very easy to overstate the case for a living language. And it kind of tended to put people in the grammar translation side of things like on their heels or on the defensive all the time, and the result of that has just been, I think, a lot of wasted time arguing when we could have just been like, yeah, that's a good resource, that's a good resource, that's a good idea, like supporting each other
Yeah.
rather than this sort of like competitive, I don't know, vitriol.
Well, it sounds like you're doing a good job with that at Glossa House. I think
I
it sounds
appreciate
like a
that.
way of doing it, and I've liked some of the resources that are there. I had a lot of fun reading through Gary Manning's Peter Rabbit
Right.
stuff. It was fun. Those are a bunch of words I didn't know in there. That was really
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, Gary is man, I'm really grateful for him, and he's if I like I do a lot of children's books,
Uh-huh.
in Greek, and if I'm getting ready to take one of those to press, Gary is the guy I go to.
Mm.
Gary, can you help me? Can you find all the errors you
Yeah,
can in here? And he has saved me from so much humiliation.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, Gary's great.
so,
He's a good friend too. Uh, we
mm,
I really appreciate him, but he's a person. If I had any sort of question
mm.
about anything Greek, I'll just go to Gary.
Mm. He's a Hawaii guy too.
He is. That's right.
Yeah, he's from Hawaii. Yeah.
He really is.
Um, so it's just interesting, man. You have a website. I want to point
Mhm.
people to that,
Yes.
and it's just kennethberding.com, right?
That's it.
Um, and there's books, articles, sermons, all kinds of different resources on there.
Yeah, and
And
I'll put up something new 3 times a month. Uh,
okay.
yeah, and so I'd love people to do it. And some of the things are a little bit more academic leaning. A lot of things are just for Christians who want to understand the Bible better, or even just want to learn how to live it out. So I go
Mm,
back and forth between the worlds that I'm interested in, which
right.
is academic stuff, but most of it is just trying to help people to learn and love and live out the Bible.
Right on.
And I'd love for
Yeah.
people to visit it if they'd like to.
Yeah, I encourage everybody watching this, listen to this. After you hit stop here, go check out kennethberding.com. Pick up some of these works. A lot of great works here. Again, the spiritual gifts book, I got to get a hold of that one.
Hmm.
How to live in Christ, walking in the Spirit, Bible revival. A bunch of your stuff we didn't even get to talk about. Maybe we'll have to pick up on that. Done stuff on the Apostolic Fathers and Bible fluency and all kinds of great stuff. So. Yeah, if you're watching or listening, check out kennethberding.com, and after you pick up some stuff there, head over to glowshouse.com and
That's
and
right.
get some stuff there. We're trying to release at least a couple books a month or a couple new resources a month. and we're kind of staying on track with that. So we have in the next 6 months. So we're recording this almost September, at the end of August 2024. But by the end of the year, I anticipate we'll have half a dozen more and yeah, more Greek resources out, but probably 3 or 4 new Hebrew resources, if not 5 or 6.
That's great.
So we have some great Greek and Hebrew resources just on, coming down the conveyor belt right now, and we are pumped. We are pumped about some of those. So yeah, keep your eyes open for that. But I think you'd really like one of those sources. I don't want to give it away here yet, but after I hit the stop button here, I'll tell you about it. So yeah, well, thanks for carving out your time and being flexible. You were really flexible with the schedule, so thanks for that. And I know you just had a new student show up right before we started, so man, I'm grateful. It's really good to meet you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good to meet you too, Michael. Really, really
And
good spending time with you.
yeah, thanks for your scholarship and the way you're investing in students and your various ministries. Yeah, I'm thrilled to hear about those things.
That's great.
Yeah. So, all right, friends, we are gonna wrap up. Yeah, we're gonna stop there and say we hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.